Welcome to you all. Thank you for being with us here today. President Zuma, before we begin, I want to just take a moment simply to ask you if you have any news on a subject that everyone here is Davos has been talking about and the whole world is asking about. Nelson Mandela was hospitalized last night, and we're told he will remain hospitalized at least until tomorrow. He has many friends here in Davos and, of course, around the world, and I know they would want me to ask if there is anything you can share with us about the President's health.
Well, I don't think I could share much. President Mandela, given his age, he has been getting to a hospital for checkup. I'm sure checkups are more frequent than when he was a healthy young man. Yeah. This, as I understand, is one of the checkups. He had been in Cape Town and then flew to Johannesburg, and he went to the clinic for a checkup. That's information I have.
Good. Have you been able to talk to the President himself?
Not yet.
Yeah.
Not yet.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And I know President Mandela has been keenly interested in the challenge of development and climate change. So with his health in our thoughts, let's move to the subject at hand. Before we dive into the very important political details, I want to ask each of you to briefly give us your assessment of the overall world situation. Politics, of course, is the art of the possible, and what's possible to accomplish is largely driven by the urgency that leaders express and the urgency that publics feel about any issue, this one in particular. So with that in mind, how do you see the climate change challenge? Is this the transcendent issue of our generation, or is it one of several challenges competing for our time and attention and, of course, for resources? Is there a gap, a mismatch between the urgency that you feel on this issue and the urgency that publics are feeling around the world? And why don't we start with you, Connie Hedegaard?
Yes, there is a mismatch, definitely. And I would say that it was as if the whole world realized 2 years back, 1 year back, how urgent this was. Then we had the financial crisis. But it's very important to say that although we have a serious financial problems and challenges, the climate challenge did not just solve itself. It did not disappear. So I think that people need still to understand the urgency. And if they were in doubt of what science have told them, just look at what we see in Pakistan, heat waves in Russia last summer, wheat prices as a consequence increasing, what we've seen in Australia. I'm not saying that all these things are climate change. I just say it's very much in line with what scientists have warned us we would see more of. So I think it should learn us that we should look more into energy efficiency, resource efficiency. When my children will be my age, we will be 9 billion people on planet Earth. So even if people do not believe in the science of climate, they should agree that we must pursue a much more energy and resource efficient way of creating our growth to all those 9 billion, which will be at the middle of this century.
President Calderón.
Well, I agree. There is a mismatch, and probably the point is any society, developed or developing country, has different priorities. For instance, talking about the economic crisis, it was very difficult to emphasize enough the problem of climate change during the deepest point of the economic crisis, because the priority of the governments and the voters was exactly the economic growth, how to recover the path in the economic field. And for developing countries, of course, there are different priorities. How to fight poverty, for instance, how to improve the condition of the people. So probably our challenge is how to mobilize people, resources. It's a challenge in terms of leadership in order to close this mismatch. There is a gap. But the point is we need to close the opinion of the scientists, the reality of climate change, with the common problems of the people. And probably one way to do that is to show to the people how related are the common problems today, as the minister was saying, the floods in Australia or the fires in Russia or the droughts in Africa, with the common problems of the people. And talking about our countries, we need to correlate that, for instance, the people that suffer the more the consequences of climate change could be the poorest people. Actually, the people that is used to suffer the floods is the poorest people who live in the very risky zones in the side of the rivers, or the people suffering the droughts is the poorest people. So the challenge is how to reach those priorities, fighting poverty or getting economic growth, but at the same time how to move our actions towards fighting climate change as well. In the political arena, the challenge is how to mobilize in terms of communications, in terms of leading public opinion towards climate change goals as well.
President Zuma.
Well, I think we're agreed. There is a mismatch, but also the challenge, I think, is very big and is very real. And I don't think the scientists will be just dreaming. I think they're telling us what's going to happen. The patterns of the weather right now indicates the reality. And I agree with my colleague here that at the end, people who are going to suffer most will be the poorest of the poor. Because if whether it's a drought or floods, in Africa we have both, it is the poorest of the poor who will suffer most. I think the question that faces us is if we all agree, because I think everybody agrees that there is a challenge. It may differ in degrees at the level at which it challenges others. In the conferences, for an example, where we have been, you would see the passion and the emotion of the island states who are saying to us is a question of life and death. As the sea rises, we are to disappear. That tells you the challenge. The challenge is not picking and choosing. The challenge is global. It challenges all of us. The question is, what is our response? I think that's where the difficulty is. Whilst the challenge is common, but I think as countries, we have, to some degree, national interests, which at times play themselves out in the process of finding a common solution. And therefore, whether people say we should resolve issues today and others saying probably tomorrow, that then is informed by very subjective at times interests of countries. I think that's a challenge. That is why, as we move from one conference to the other, wanting to find a common solution so that we all act in unison, that becomes very difficult. Others begin to pull their feet back. I think that's where the problem is.
The challenge is global, but of course all politics is local.
That's a problem.
Secretary Figueres.
I think we're caught between a fortunately increasing awareness and still a lack of expediency. So let us take Cancun as the most recent example of that. Under the very able leadership of Minister Espinosa and President Calderón, countries in Cancun reached an international agreement that is nothing short of miraculous. It is an extraordinary achievement. I call Cancun a big step for the community of nations. But unfortunately, it's also at the same time a very small step for the planet. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Under the Cancun agreements, basically countries have done three very important things. Number one, they have brought together as a group of nations, they have brought together the greatest collective effort of emission reductions ever, well beyond what we expect from the Kyoto Protocol. That is a major achievement. Secondly, what Cancun does is provide the most comprehensive package of support for developing countries to address both mitigation, reduction of emissions, and adaptation. And that is comprised of both the financial component of the Cancun agreements, the Green Fund, as well as the technology mechanism that will allow countries access to technology. So that is a major achievement. And thirdly, under the Cancun agreements, what has happened is countries have been able to give the strongest signal that they have ever given about we are moving toward a low-carbon economy and a low-carbon growth. That is also a major achievement. Never before had countries agreed to bring the temperature increase to a maximum of 2 degrees. Major achievement. Now, it is a small step for the planet, because despite the fact that we have this remarkable agreement in Cancun, the fact is that those emissions that are on the table are only 60% of what we need in order to reach the 2%, the 2-degree centigrade maximum temperature that countries agreed to. So there is a gap there, not just in the speed, but also in the volume and in the ambition. And what countries need to do now is implement very quickly this year the agreement of Cancun, but at the same time, they need to raise their level of ambition. Global emissions have to peak by 2015 if we want to stand any chance of stabilizing. 2015, honestly, that's the day after tomorrow.
And just to linger on the point for 1 second, so what you're saying is that even if everything goes perfectly from now, and even if every proposal currently on the table goes into full effect and works as we expect it to, the temperature will still probably rise more than the Earth can tolerate in terms of human civilization.
Absolutely, and the estimates are that with the emission reductions that we have now, temperatures will rise somewhere between 3 and 3.9. Maximum that science says is 2, and in fact, if we want to guarantee the survival of the least developed countries and of small island states, we should be looking at 1.5.
So we'll come back to the question of what would we need to do enough. But before we do, I want to turn to Cancun. As you just heard, you get high marks for your successful management of that process. And I know that you and President Zuma had a chance to talk just before this panel. I was wondering if you could share with us and with him here on the public stage, as you passed the baton to him on the climate change process, what were the most important things you learned about this and your best advice to him on how to proceed?
Well, I'm not able to advise my friend President Zuma, but one of the important things that we made in Cancun is we try to listen everyone. We try to listen all the voices. We try to understand all the interests. We listen the voices of the Chinese government, India's government, American people, Japanese, European Union. We went to Africa, to African Union to listen the opinion and interests of the African countries. We'll listen how disappointed African countries are about all the promises that have been made during years in favor of Africa and the lack of outcome in concrete actions for them. And at the same time, we try to bring in the table all the interests. Other things is we try to be very transparent in the process. We bring on the table all the proposals. We share the responsibility of the negotiation with several ministers and participants coming from several parts of the world. So it is very important to have a fair, transparent, very active process of negotiation. That's a very important part of the outcome. And I think that if we can follow on track on that, we can get a very important success in Durban this year.
I'm going to come to President Zuma in a moment. Before I do, I want to ask Connie Hedegaard, you were deeply involved in the Copenhagen process, which didn't get such high marks in many ways. Are there any learnings from Copenhagen that you want to share with President Zuma, perhaps for what not to do?
I'm not sure he needs more advice in that sense, because what we also can sort of see from the different processes is what matters in the end is, will the political will be there? Yes, you must be transparent. Yes, everybody will have to be consulted. Business will have to be included, civil society, NGO, as we all have done for years. That, of course, is very important, but I think what made the difference in Cancun was, despite the skilled Mexican efforts doing all the right things, but also that the leaders and the governments was so scared from not having been able to deliver all the things they should have delivered in Copenhagen. And they understood that if they repeated that in Cancun, then the multilateral process would be dead. And that would particularly be a big problem for many of the most poor countries, many of the developing countries, who, as we have heard, will suffer the most, but who will have no chance then to be represented if it is handled in G20 or whatever other forum. But just a final point on that, there is no other international forum where everybody can agree to do more than in the UN forum. And that's why, although it's slow, sometimes inefficient, everybody has to be heard, and it takes a long time and much too much time for some of us, then that is the process we have, and that's why we need to build on Cancun and on Copenhagen, where we also got the targets, and then to build new building blocks, get new building blocks accepted in South Africa. We have a lot of implementation to do this year. But I think that most viewers also would agree that implementation, that is not exactly political momentum. It can be, but we need some new achievements also to be reached in South Africa, and we will do whatever we can from the European Union to make that happen in South Africa.
So President Zuma, sounds like you have a significant challenge ahead of you this year. Can you share a little bit of your thoughts about how you plan to organize Durban and what your key goals are?
Well, as you hear, the challenge is quite huge. I'm sure my good brother here had also a huge challenge. But of course, from the experience of Cancun, we are going to learn a great deal. I think firstly, the question of listening to everybody is absolutely crucial. You cannot do anything without listening. And also being transparent. I don't think we should view other views in a lighter note and view others more seriously. I think we should view all of them equally. I know, as I mentioned earlier, for an example, that countries from small island states, if you met them, and we met them in Cancun, in one lunch meeting, they speak as if tomorrow is no longer there. And it is a reality, and they're very passionate about it. How do we meet those challenges? Leaving aside countries that say, well, we'll be affected, but we'll still exist. How do you balance all of that? So it's a question of listening to everybody. You can't do, and therefore you cannot, having not listened, begin to say, this is what I want to do. I think the advice that we should listen is absolutely correct. We'll take it as it has been experienced in Cancun. But it means a lot of work, because we have from Cancun agreements that I agree with have moved, in fact, beyond the expectations, because after Copenhagen, there was a demoralization. But I think Cancun has brought back the confidence. So you are faced on one side by the challenge of implementing these agreements. And I don't think it's going to be easy. Because as I said, some people might not be as enthusiastic. But once we have agreements, we must implement those agreements. So we've got to work hard at that level. But then say, how do we put the building blocks to an agreement in Durban that will be an advance of what has happened in Cancun? That is a challenge, I think, that is going to face us. We are therefore going to listen, and I think the views of people and the experiences are going to inform us that with time, in the course of the year, working very much closely and together with the Mexicans, with their experience, that will certainly shape our view in the course of time, and we'll be able to gauge how far Durban will go. But that is going to, I think, be determined in the main by the effort we are going to put, and we are determined to put a very, very serious effort to ensure that we are able to make some progress in Durban. One of the reasons we should succeed, which is similar to what happened in Cancun, is that it for the first time that this important gathering goes to Africa, which faces serious problems in this climate change challenge. And I think we've got it to, even if it for anything, but to give confidence to the people who live in the developing world, that we are in their own backyard, and therefore we are concerned about their own challenges. We have therefore challenges to us in many dimensions, politically, socially, and otherwise. So I don't think we should fail, but Durban cannot be on its own. South Africa can't make it happen on its own. I think the collective effort is going to be very critical to everybody else, that we are working together We don't say this Durban belongs to South Africa, but that this is a challenge, a global challenge to everyone. Therefore, it is a responsibility of everyone that we must succeed in Durban. We will provide the venue. We'll work hard to ensure that in Durban we succeed. And I rely a great deal to my colleague and friend here, who was very passionate, who was all over the world, convincing people, taking proposals, trying to match them, balancing them, and he succeeded, and will do exactly the same.
So let's talk for a minute about listening to all these voices and two specific voices. Almost half of the world's carbon emissions come from two countries, China and the United States. We're pleased to have this panel, but of course no one from China is here and no one from the United States is here except me, and I'm not authorized to speak for any carbon footprint except my own. So I took the liberty of bringing a quotation from the chief American envoy and the chief Chinese envoy on climate change issues, and I just wanted to read them and then ask you all to talk a little bit about
what's the date
what's
of
obvious.
those quotations?
Well, fair point, and some of them are older than others, and we'll come to that. But on the other hand, I'd ask you whether you see any change over time.
Okay.
So first, Obama's envoy. You cannot address the climate change challenge by focusing only on developed countries. You cannot build a system premised on the notion that China should be treated the same as Chad. As a matter of political reality, we could not get support in the United States, notably in Congress, for a climate agreement that required action of us, but not from China and the other emerging markets. On the other side, from China, developed countries are using climate change issues to restrict the development of developing countries and maintain the north-south gap between the rich and the poor, with countries like China, Brazil, and India particularly targeted. That's the word, targeted. They are very worried about China's pace of development. Sounds like you have a fairly large gap. President Calderón?
Well, probably that is exactly the problem, or that was the problem. My perception is that we lost a lot of time in the world blaming each other, developed and developing country. And we lost a lot of time discussing about the issue of binding commitment or not binding commitment. Who is responsible about climate change, who is responsible about the action against it. And I think that we tried to move the discussion from that. And we were looking for serious commitment coming from either developed or developing countries. And as the Secretary was saying, one of the differences in the outcome of Cancun respect to the Kyoto Protocol is, under Kyoto Protocol, there are commitments of more or less 5% of reduction of emissions coming from some developed countries, with the exception of the United States, by the way. But coming under the Cancun agreements based upon the Copenhagen Agreement, the conference formalized the commitment or national action plans coming from developed or developing countries. So the total commitments in terms of reductions of emission coming from Cancun implies a reduction of 14%. And not only from developed countries, but also from developing countries. So in that sense, the outcome of Cancun is better than we had before in terms of the Kyoto Protocol. Of course, we need to go in order to get a new stage, a new era in terms of the Kyoto Protocol. But we solve or we break that gridlock that you were mentioning, blaming developed countries to developing countries, blaming United States, China. We didn't move by 3 or 4 years or the other way around. The key issue is to understand the so-called principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. And in that sense, it was a pleasure to see how China, for instance, made serious commitment on that. By first time, China, India, made a tremendous effort, and they bring to the table national actions program, national action plan, in order to reduce emission, in order to improve forestry and others. So it's a bold step in the right direction. It's not enough, I agree, but a journey of 1,000 miles start by one step, and this is a very good one.
Commissioner Hedegaard and then Secretary
Yeah, we didn't
Figueres.
hear the dates from these quotations, but I would also argue they are a bit outdated. I agree very much with the President, because since the run-up to Copenhagen, since the fall of 2009, a lot of these countries, 80 all in all, or a bit more actually now, have set domestic targets, including China, including India, including South Africa, including many of the world's biggest economies and a lot of others. So that's the new situation. If we had met here 2 years ago, basically only Europe and Norway and a few others would have set targets. Now they have set targets. So I think when, for instance, we see the next Chinese 5-year plan being published very soon, I think many will be in for a surprise because they are actually doing this. So it's not something that will hamper their development. On the contrary, they now themselves say this is an investment in a much more energy efficient and low carbon future that they need and that they can prosper from. And I think that we also saw in President Obama's State of the Union speech only 2 days ago that he also said, why do we not stop subsidizing fossil fuels? That is sort of the past. Why instead not invest in the future? And he mentioned why the future should be cleaner energy. So the Americans are not quite there yet maybe, but at least he invited his Congress to try to do more in this field. So in that sense, we have come a long way since 3, 4, 5 years back. The world is actually starting to act now.
Secretary Vicaris?
Well, I completely agree with both President Calderón and Commissioner Hedegaard, because the fact is the blame game will continue if we only focus on what is the cost and who's going to pay. But if we also focus on the other component of climate, which is the opportunity that is brought by those measures that address climate, then we have a completely different lineup. Then we have the fact that any intervention on climate, which has to do with resource efficiency, actually contributes to sustainable development. And in that sense, it's very important that the next conference is in Africa, because if there ever was a continent that is still struggling to figure out how does the continent move forward in a sustainable manner, and how does it eradicate poverty? How does it ensure that there is food? How does it ensure that there is water available? The fact is, most of the measures that you have for addressing climate are also at the same time contributing to solutions on many of the other issues that developing countries have. So there is a win-win opportunity here. And China, as Commissioner Hedegaard has said, China has realized this. China, honestly, is going to leave us all in the dust. China is committed to winning the green race, and honestly, they're not doing it just because they want to save the planet. They're doing it because it's good for their economy. And I think that's the name of the game. How can countries, in particular developing countries, how can they take advantage of the international policy framework that is given by Cancun and will be given by Durban? How can they take advantage of that international policy framework for their own national priorities and development goals? That is the way to see it. That's the way to see that you can leapfrog. You don't have to follow the model of the North. You can actually, as China is already doing, you can actually push forward, move beyond the dependency on fossil, and actually do a much cleaner path that takes you to the development and the growth that you need.
I want to come back both to China's energy plans and to President Obama's State of the Union, but before I do, I want to ask President Zuma, how do you see your mission and the mission of South Africa in reaching the rest of the developing world, in reaching China, in reaching India, and of course, in reaching the rest of Africa on this issue?
Well, firstly, I agree with my colleagues that we have reached a point, I think, where we needed to lessen the emphasis on differences, because the framework that has been agreed upon helps us to give us an entry to move forward. We need to say, on the basis of the agreements we have, how do we take them forward? That should be the manner in which we approach people. I don't think we could go to countries and say, look, you emit too much, and therefore you need to do this and pay. We need to say, how do we move forward with agreements that we already have? I think, as I said earlier, the debate is going to be, how do we implement the agreements that we have? Because they themselves are going to be a challenge. That in itself is going to make people to realize that, in fact, we are agreeing on the issue of cleaner energy, for an example. Everybody agrees. There's nobody who says we can't do it. And I think there is further agreement that, in fact, there are more business opportunities in the cleaner kind of energy, as well as opportunities for job creation. So it is, in other words, not saying stop your economic development. What is happening is that whilst we are dealing with the issues of emission and other things, but at the same time, many countries are in fact working hard, including China, on cleaner energy. So you are dealing with a situation where there is already action. So we are going to be talking to people as to how do we take further steps on these matters. I think it is important, and I think Cancun was absolutely correct, to put aside the differences, the blaming one another, but to say how do we move forward all together. I think that's an approach that we're going to undertake as we move forward. Of course, working together with the colleagues, tapping on their experiences, because it proved that in fact it works. When we are not pointing fingers, we are all trying to seek solutions.
Mm-hmm. Say one more word about business and business's role here. We're, of course, at the World Economic Forum, a conference of CEOs, in essence. They invite us as their guests. How do you see the role of business going forward, and how do you hope to influence it?
I think business has a bigger role to play. In fact, I think it has not been sufficiently emphasized. Because if you talk about emissions, who emits? It's business, isn't that so? But of course, they are, in a sense, because they're not governments. The governments seem to be the ones who are battling with this issue. But business is part of it. I think that's one thing we need to do. And I'm happy that we are having this debate here in WEF, because the business must identify more strongly, probably take the blame equally with governments. Because it's not just governments alone that emit. If anything, I'm sure government must have emitted very little compared to business. So business must find a role to play in terms of going forward. I think that's one of the areas we are going to work very hard leading to Durban, to convince business to be party to this, so that it is not just governments alone. It is the responsibility of all of us. Business must know they have a role to play, they have a responsibility, they are part of the problem, and they must be part of the solution, as the government have been.
President Calderón.
One thing about business. So, first, a lot of business could be profitable in terms of some of the measures related with climate change. For instance, most of the energy efficiency measures will be profitable for the enterprises. If you can save energy in the process in which you can produce the same or even more with less energy, you will save a lot of money. So one of the focus that we need to emphasize is this part about how profitable it is to save energy and to reduce emissions. Second, with the right public policies, there will be a lot of opportunities for the business community. For instance, for decades, we used to subsidize the fossil energy. So maybe we need to establish some kind of economic incentives for renewable energy. Or even without that, there are a lot of opportunities for energy companies in order to produce this renewable energy. Wind energy, maybe in the future, solar energy is not profitable, not yet, but the technology is moving ahead. But the key issue is we could find a set of measures that they have positive net present value in economic terms, and all those measures will be very useful for a specific business and also will be very useful in order to reduce emissions and to fight climate change.
Commissioner Hedegaard.
I think there is a labor division between politicians and business. Politicians will have to set up the political framework so that the business has what they need, that is predictability. There must be some long-term pathway. That is where we are going. This would be the frameworks. This would be the incentives. Because the solutions has to come from business. They will have to come with the new ways of doing things, the alternative ways of doing things, the new technologies that we really do not have enough today, and to disseminate it. How do we do that? That is why setting the political targets are so crucial, because then we can set a price on carbon. If it costs a lot to pollute a lot, then business has the incentive to pollute less. That is basically what we are talking about, is all about. How do we make business invest in these things we need, in the transformation that we need, in energy to Africa, for instance? How can we make that attractive for business? That's not the public sectors alone to do that. Business will have to do it. So in order to make these investments, there need to be some incentives. If it is expensive to be very inefficient, then business will try to be very efficient and have to pay less. And if we get that, then we also get the innovation. So it's about how we can cooperate to get the good circles going. I just mention one more time, we were discussing a bit sort of, is it a cost? Will China, will US, will business invest in this? Recently, the International Energy Agency could announce that just for Europe alone, Europe's 27 member states, last year paid $70 billion more for our imported oil than the year before. Can you imagine if a bill like that, instead of those $70 billion going just to buy for oil, if we instead invested in energy efficiency, in new technologies? And I mean, we are doing that in Europe, setting targets, creating the markets. We are doing a lot. But we can do a lot more. And then we would save all the money that we today spend for still more expensive fossil fuels, still more expensive resources. Is one thing is for sure when we exit the crisis is that resources and energy will become more expensive. Wouldn't it be a much more intelligent strategy instead to invest some of this money into more efficient, resource-efficient solutions? I think that that is also a good strategy for business.
I just came back from the World Future Energy Summit in Abu Dhabi last week, and it's fascinating to be in the United Arab Emirates, the third largest oil exporter in the world, and see that that country has decided that its future certainly has some still link to oil, but actually they are moving forward with renewable energy with a vigor that is really unmatched by other countries. The UAE has decided that actually they will continue to be oil exporters, but they're reframing that to say we're going to be energy producers and energy exporters. That's a very different reframing than to say we're only oil exporters. And it seems to me that most of the oil exporting countries are really now challenged by this vision of the UAE to see, can they also reframe? The fact is, the International Energy Agency tells us that moving down the line, it's not that we're going to run out of oil, and we're not going to be completely oil dependent. In fact, probably by the year 2030, 2050, we will still be using 60% of oil to charge, to generate our energy. But the growth of energy demand will allow for a much increased market that can be filled with the right policies, 40% by renewable energy. So 40-60, and there's a huge opportunity there for all countries that have natural resources, and we all do. Every single country has either water or wind or solar. We all have those opportunities. It's a very sad comment on our economy that the fact is that worldwide we have 12 times more subsidies for fossil fuel than we have for renewable energy, to pick up Connie's point. And the fact is most developing countries are being broken by the subsidies that they're giving to fossil fuels because it's something that they can't afford anymore. Well, if we could lift fossil fuel subsidies and instead of that put it into renewable energies, we would have a much more balanced trade bill in countries, and we would have a much healthier energy mix in developing countries, which is where we need to go.
Let's follow up for a moment on something you mentioned earlier related to future energy and China. You pointed out that China is embarked on what's probably the greatest effort in history to create green energy. But it's also true as part of their plans that they're embarked on one of the greatest expansions in history on coal-generated electricity. Is this good enough? Is this going to get us where we need to go?
Well, As I said, I don't think that we can be naive enough to think that we're going to live in a fossil fuel free world. That's just naive. What we have to begin to understand is that the fossil fuels that we will have to continue to use need to come down in their carbon intensity. We need to move from the more carbon intensive to the less carbon intensive fossil fuels, and even there we need to use new technologies such as carbon capture and sequestration to actually be able to use those fossils in a much more responsible way. So I would say that is realistic, but the other energies need to be a much more important part. And there all of the renewable energies need to come in, particularly for those countries that have to import fossil fuel. I mean, if there ever was a very clear case, it's developing countries that import fossil fuels and on top of that subsidize the use of those fossil fuels for their citizens. That is just such a compelling case of really the lack of vision into the future and the absolute urgent need to change those policies.
President Calderon, let me follow up on something Connie Hedegaard said and ask you a political question. So President Obama this week in his State of the Union message talked a great deal about clean energy. But there was something striking at the same time. Here's a candidate, when he was running for office, who spoke eloquently and passionately about global warming and about his commitment to the issue. He never mentioned the word in his State of the Union message, never said global warming, never said climate change, never mentioned the word carbon, although I guess he did say fossil fuels. Can we actually grapple with this issue if the President of the United States can't even use the word?
I don't know. Maybe it's a problem for the American people and American journalists.
They're very close to you.
But the point is, as you were saying, politics used to be around what is possible. Mm. And if you can move the people and the Congress, maybe doing some kind of things with the language or trying to avoid the more risky words, and you can do that, you must do that. Of course, the world is waiting for a bold action coming from the United States. That's the truth. So it is important that the President of the United States and the Congress of the United States do their work. That's the truth. The leadership of the American society and the American politicians is needed in the world. And it is impossible to do something serious without the American participation. So the United States must to participate in the future in a more important way. So if the President of the United States considers that in order to mobilize people, society, and the Congress, needs to use some specific words and avoid other words, probably it's his problem, but what the world is waiting is action coming from U.S. Mm-hmm. I don't care about the words, I care about the action. I want to see the action, the programs, and the commitments coming from the United States. There are some, according to the Copenhagen and Cancun agreements, some commitments. That's a step again. It's not enough, but today the United States is the largest economy in the world, is the first or the second emitters, so it is needed to do something serious, and we are waiting for that. Mm-hmm.
What does that need to look like, President Zuma, the actions from the United States?
Well, it's a serious commitment, I know. Actions.
No, I think the President is correct. We can't speak on behalf of other leaders in their countries. As you said when you were asking this a political question, because you can't tell other leaders what to do. But I think the correct point is that there's a challenge that faces humanity. The United States is one of the recognized leaders of the world. They can't be out of it. That's a challenge, I think, that faces the United States. Not only President Obama only, the entire United States. What is it that they've got to do tangibly to ensure that there is action that takes us to the right direction? I don't think you could avoid it. But as a leader, there may be issues that you have to deal with at a particular time. I remember, for a fact that during President Bush's time, very little was done in this direction. And therefore that made the American society to lag behind to some degree. I think ever since President Obama came in, he has been very active on this. And he has moved, I think, the American society to a certain level. I think he will still do it. I agree, we need action. Don't want to describe what action. We can't prescribe for other people. But we need action within the context of what the world is agreeing to do. And the United States must appear in the leadership. That's a critical challenge that faces the United States.
Commissioner Haggard, you seem to be viewing the President's statement this week, President Obama, as at least a glass half full.
No, actually what I said was that it was very good that also the American president this week said we should sort of start to look into the future and invest in the future. That was a good and welcome signal. But actually in my comment yesterday to the speech, I also noted the fact that it was not foreboding very well for South Africa in the climate conference that the president was not once mentioning the climate change challenge. I understand that that is because of the political situation. How can we change that? I mean, we are not the ones who can do that. But I think that American business should be aware that if we are right up here saying that basically this is also a race on who will first get their economies transitioned into becoming much more efficient, energy efficient, resource efficient economies, then it's really bad economics. It's bad business not to be among the front runners, but be hesitating. And I would really hope that the American business, I know that some of them will be here in Davos. I know that some of them also have been convinced a long time ago, and they are lobbying at the Congress. But I hope that even more American business people would understand that they need to put the pressure on their politicians. And as President Zuma says, also because the world needs the leadership of the United States. But if they are dragging their feet, that is no good for these negotiations, but it's definitely also no good for the United States leadership, also not in business. Because as Christian Figueres was saying, the Chinese are not just pouring a lot of money into this area for sort of feeling good or contributing to solving the climate challenge problem. It's good that they also think that this is part of it, but they are doing it because they have realized it's good business. We can see in Europe, it is good business. We have created millions of jobs in the sector of renewables, for instance, and in the energy efficient sector in recent years. So it's not just something we claim, that green and sustainable growth can create jobs. We are many who can prove that that is how it actually has happened in our own economies.
Mm-hmm. President Calderón, do you worry? You said earlier that we'd wasted several years trying to get past the blame game. Do you worry now that we'll wait several years waiting for the United States to get back in the process?
I hope not. But we made a step. That's important. So because the participation of the American delegations in Cancun was important to move forward in the agreements. And there are a set of commitments coming from the American side. We're talking about 17% of reductions, considering 2005 year, not the original base, but it's a step anyway. Well, we need now that they could fulfill this commitment, and in addition to that, that the American government put in place a set of public policies in order to reach that, and in the Congress, of course, take a serious step on that. Yes, I'm afraid that probably the priorities, again, in the American side, the American society, could be how to recover the growth, how to go out of the economic crisis. But we must to emphasize in that public opinion how important climate change is for them and for the humankind. And I agree with them in the sense that there are a lot of business opportunity, and that could be a very important incentives in order to move in the right direction. But in my modest opinion, it's not only about business opportunity, it is about pressure on public opinion as well. My perception is the Chinese position was moved in a very important way, of course, but because it is convenient for the Chinese government and people, but also because there was public opinion pressing a lot, asking for a commitment coming from the Chinese part. And now we need to press in public opinion in order to get clear commitment and clear action coming from the most important nation in the world up now. And the other is is not only pressure, but also we need to change the perception and the public opinion in the American society. Because my perception is most of the people in the United States are afraid about the economic situation. They perceive this issue of climate change like an obstacle for their own progress. And we need to switch that perception. We need to explain the problem, and we need to gain support in public opinion. And that support in public opinion could move the votes in the Congress, which is needed. Mm-hmm. And with the votes in the Congress, I'm absolutely sure that President Obama will make the right steps in this direction. Actually, I believe in the serious commitment of President Obama, but he has not, at least by the moment, enough support that he needs in the Congress. But we need to move, or everyone should move public opinion, and that's the idea of this kind of forum here in Davos and in anywhere.
So at the beginning, you all agreed that there was a mismatch between the urgency of the issue and public opinion, not only in the United States, but elsewhere in the world as well. Let me ask you a question about reaching the publics around the world. The forum, the World Economic Forum, issued a report earlier this week in advance of this conference in which they listed the challenges facing the world, the most important risks facing the globe. They listed 37 of them. Climate change was there, very high on the list, but there were 37. How do you get people to focus in a world where there are so many problems and so many risks and say we have to deal with climate change?
Well, it is a question of leadership. And leadership is about it, how to mobilize people and resources, how to persuade the people how important is one thing. I believe that climate change is a very important issue because, of course, I believe that poverty is a very important issue. My country has a serious problem of poverty, and we are improving the condition of the people. We have public policies for that. We have very serious healthcare program and so on. But at the same time, it is important that the leaders of the world, not only in the political community, but also in the business community, we must work together in order to explain the problem, how serious is that, and persuade the people that this is important, not only for the future, also for the present. And it's our task to persuade the people how important is this.
Connie Hedegaard and...
Yeah, just for the fairness of it, I would also very much like to support what President Calderón said. It's very different to deal with the President Obama administration compared to earlier. They are actually trying to engage as much as they can and constructively in the negotiations. On this question, what can we do to persuade people? I think that it's very key that we try also to make a positive narrative around this. That it's not just about what we cannot do and how expensive it is and how difficult it is, but how can we build a much more intelligent society? More intelligent houses, more intelligent planning systems in our cities, more intelligent way of transportation. I mean, it's not sort of a gray, dull society. It's actually the only way we can create a society where 9 billion people can live peacefully together with one another. And where also those countries who have not gotten a big share in modern commodities yet with all their peoples, they get a chance to get it. So I think if we link this issue to energy, to security, to the resource discussion, then I think a lot of people can understand, wow, this is true, we have to do something. And by the way, energy was rather high up on the list of concerns. I saw that.
Yeah. President Zuma and then Secretary Figueres.
I totally agree. There are many challenges, and some of them very serious. But I think their effectiveness is not the same. For an example, the question of education. The bulk of people in the developing world need education. It's very urgent. Poverty, very critical. HIV and AIDS, these are pressing questions. But if we take the climate change and the challenge that it imposes, and the things that we are saying should be done in order to deal with it, therefore, the renewable and clean energy, which creates jobs, you are dealing with poverty. So it's a question of how do we package our campaign publicly to actually begin to convince society that going the route of renewable energy, clean energy, you are in fact addressing some of the challenges that were listed. I think that's the way we should go, so that we don't create a confrontation. We create a user-friendly approach, which is going to make everybody see the advantage. And I think I agree with my colleagues that the business sector must come in to see the green energy as a new opportunity that has a long future, and therefore participate in that. I think if we package it properly, we'll certainly succeed.
We're nearly out of time, but Secretary Figueres.
Well, I think we're all saying the same thing, and I think it's a matter of not looking at those 37 risks as being silos. The fact is, in the real world, they're all interlinked. And the trick here is to figure out which of the interventions that governments, private sector, and civil society can make actually are the points of highest leverage. And coincidentally, most of the measures that climate would require actually contribute to many of the other risks. If we let climate go unchecked, it is a serious, serious threat to most of the human development progress that we have had over the last 20 to 25 years. If, on the other hand, we move on the climate agenda, we're contributing to food security, we're contributing to water stability, we're contributing to stable and sustainable urbanization. We're contributing to energy access. We're contributing to so many of the other things that if you parcel them out, of course, you get overwhelmed. But the fact is, we can bring them together, and that's what we should be doing. We should be looking for the points of intervention of highest leverage and prioritizing those, because those will then have a beneficial effect on many of the global risks that have been identified by the World Economic Forum.
Let's take one moment just to talk about one thing that's been mentioned several times but not really lingered on: the population of the globe. The UN says it will pass 7 billion this year, 9 billion by the time your children are grown. That's a lot of people. That means that in order to achieve the reductions that you're saying are necessary, the actual per capita consumption of each individual has to decline even more.
Yep.
How does that happen?
The Secretary General calls it his 50-50 challenge. By 2050, we will have 50% more population, and we have to have reduced 50% of the emissions. A major task. A major task, but it is doable. It is doable because we have the technologies at hand. What we need is the political will to actually send a very strong signal that will let the capital investment decisions actually migrate into those areas that are actually going to be sustainable over the long run. The capital investment is going to occur anyway. It's a question of which way is it going to go. So it's a question of governments getting together and sending yet an even stronger signal that they already sent in Cancun.
We are out of time. I'm going to give the final word to President Zuma. Remember, you have a worldwide audience as well as the business leaders here in Davos. Tell us what you would like to see from the world and from the business leaders as you head for Durban.
Well, I would like to see, firstly, I think the issue of the population growth must become part of our vocabulary. We cannot just talk about the population as if we are standing at one point. The very fact that we are getting into billions, it means, therefore, the more the population, the more efficient we need to be in terms of how do we maintain ourselves, how do we consume
30 seconds left.
Very important. So we are calling upon the world to come together once again and prepare to work harder to make Durban even a better success. And we are going to be with everybody, listening and indeed taking the proposals and finding ways and means, very user-friendly, that will make us move forward. I think the Cancun has given us a platform from which to move forward.
Thank you, President Zuma. To all our panelists, thank you very much. This has been the Associated Press Davos debate on climate change. I thank you all. Thank you.